Okay, so I'm going to get started if everybody's good. Are we good? Everybody good?
Yeah.
All right, let's do this. I am Claudia Taylor, Director of Regional Programming for the UNT Alumni Association, and welcome to episode 6 of UNT Alumni Live. Today, we are thrilled to welcome alumnus and photographer Brandon Thibodeaux. Brandon has had an incredible career shooting for the New York Times, ESPN, and many other publications and museums, but he also once photographed everything going on right here on campus for the North Texas Daily. Today, we'll talk about visual storytelling and how to channel your own photography skills to capture your best images ever. Before we get started, just a few reminders. If you're joining us on Zoom, please check out the chat section at the bottom of your screen. I'll be posting some useful links there. And you can also use that to send me questions. If you're watching on Facebook Live, make sure you open the UNT Alumni Association app, go to events and check in to this event that you're watching. I will send you all a code so you can do that. So you can enter the code and make sure we know you're here. And as always, you can also leave me questions and comments on the Facebook Live channel, and we will get to as many questions of yours as we can. Now, before I hand the program over to my colleague, Casey Kameninski, let me tell you a little bit about our featured guest, Brandon Thibodeaux. Brandon earned a bachelor's degree from UNT in 2006. During his senior year at UNT, he shot for the Dallas Morning News and traveled frequently to photograph a small village in Alaska, sparking a passion for photographing the American landscape and the people who make it so unique. He is a guest instructor with the Santa Fe Photographic and Institute and Maine Media Workshops, as well as both the Houston and Los Angeles Centers for Photography. His work is featured in museums, including Houston's Museum of Fine Arts and the Museum of Photographic Arts in San Diego, as well as many private collections. His book, In That Land of Perfect Day, features photos shot over 8 years in the Mississippi Delta, depicting the region's history and the rural African-American experience. Today, we'll get a behind the lens look at some of Brandon's favorite shots and learn more about the difference between a good photograph and a great one. Casey, take it away.
Wow. Thank you, Claudia, and welcome, Brandon. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to speak with us today. I am personally really excited for this particular episode because this is like my home field. This is my territory. This is something I know and love, and that's photography. And so when we first met Brandon the first time, we realized that we have a lot in common, including our network. So to see, old friends from college log in like Melissa, that's pretty special. So thank you guys for being here and supporting Brandon in this episode. So Brandon, I just want to get right to it. And I want to know, what took you to UNT? How did you end up there?
It's just funny how life kind of drags you along where it needs to go. And I started out, I guess I could start from the beginning. When I was 16, 17, 18, I developed stage 4 lymphoma and spent my high school years dealing with that and did my chemo the summer after graduating. And I took that first semester and kind of floundered about. I even went to SFA for pre-med, thinking, gosh, all this medical experience, surely I'll be a doctor. That didn't work out after one semester. So I transferred back home to Beaumont at Lamar University and needed an elective. And my roommate at the time had said, gosh, well, my uncle teaches a photography class, you ought to take that. And I did. And suddenly, this drive to sort of explore the world and learn about my place within it. Suddenly I had this tangible, a craft that I could interpret those feelings and experiences with. And while there, I had an aunt get me a job working Friday night football for a local magazine. And I met a woman who was also a UNT alum named Margaret Toll on the sidelines of one of these Southeast Texas football fields. And she said, do you want a job? I said, yeah, of course. So she said, if you can shoot the Lions Club Carnival tomorrow and you knock it out of the park, I'll give you a job. And I got my first big bulldog spread in the newspaper, the Orange Leader, and Margaret hired me. And I spent the next 2 years really in this experiential boot camp. I could be, I was 21 years old, so I could be in a kindergarten classroom at 8, a homicide at 9, and a basketball game by 7:30. And it was really just a grab bag. But, early on, I think I learned how to to approach people, how to be in uncomfortable places, with people you don't know, how to make friends really quickly. And when Margaret saw that I was really taking a liking to the job, she suggested I go to UNT, where she graduated from. And so I swiftly packed my bags and loaded up my scholarship monies and a couple federal grants and made it to Denton. And and so next thing you know, I found myself in Denton for 3 years.
Yeah. For 3 years. And
2004 to 2006. That's right.
Okay, so we had an overlap there because I was graduating in 2004 and finished up my final semester there in the bottom of the GAB, and we were just transitioning from film and scanning all of our film in to digital, and I think we had one dark room left, and so you didn't have to shoot any film at UNT, is that right?
Yeah, by that time the wet labs were gone. I think we had some that were maybe reserved for taking some quiet time or making out with your girlfriend or something. But for the most part, it was all IMAX everywhere. So all my film shooting was done at Lamar in their wet labs. And so by the time, like when I was at the Orange Leader with Margaret, that was early 2000s. So we were in that cross point where I was still running film to Walgreens because their lab had shut down. And process my film at Walgreens and then run back to the office to scan it all in real fast. And then eventually we hit digital. So by the time I got to UNT, I was well on my way into digital photography.
That's awesome. So I personally have to know, DSLR or mirrorless camera, what are you shooting with these days?
If any UNT alums have deep pockets and want to buy a mirrorless for me, I'm more than happy. But so far I'm still with a DSLR.
Same. I feel you. Those mirrorless, they're beautiful, aren't they? They're so lightweight.
Beautiful price tag.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So we do have a question from the audience. So I'm going to go ahead and throw that one at you real quick. It says, someone's asking, is travel an important part of your creative process?
Gosh, I have this quote that I've kind of lived by for the longest time. And it was by Marcel Proust that said, the true voyage to discovery lies not in the seeking of new lands, but in having new eyes. And I think that's something to live by. I mean, as an early photojournalist, I had this idea, and we can get into this later, but that, in order to tell, great stories and important stories, you had to go far, and the fact is, I've always believed that if you can't see the world in your own backyard, the world that lies outside that gate isn't of much worth to you either. So, while I, like most people, enjoy a travel assignment or finding myself in a far-flung place, it's certainly not the one thing that I like to focus on, but I love the experience for sure.
Absolutely.
There's nothing like immersing yourself and grounding yourself somewhere else too. I think that whole experience is, is valuable in understanding who you are and how you relate to the world,
Absolutely. And Brandon, I understand that you have some images that you can share with us that, from some of your personal journeys and stories. You've published a book and you've been featured in some museums and you've shot for many great agencies. So I'd love it if you'd be willing to share something with us and we can kind of talk about the backstory behind that.
Sure. Yeah. Let me get my stuff going right quick.
Sure.
We can start out with, I suppose the stuff, we can just go chronologically and start out with the stuff from UNT and see how things moved along from there. Let's see here. I'll just give like a brief segue. I mean, my feeling about photography could be summed up in these next sort of 3 slides. It was taught early on to me, like the power of language and the importance of reading and embedding, a vocabulary within yourself. And Ellen Gilchrist had this quote that says, "We live at the level of our language. What we can articulate, we can imagine or understand or explore." And I think that's invaluable, not just in the idea of making images, but, who we are and what we imagine, it informs our image making. And I firmly believe that as photographers, sculptors, artists, we are the torchbearers of one of mankind's most defining traits, and that's storytelling. From the hand-pigmented cave walls of Paleolithic man to telling those intricate stories in these multi-dimensional platforms with those same hands today, right? So that's, ultimately photography has been my choice of medium, but fundamentally the one thing that I think I strive for is creating narrative. And with that, since the beginning of my work at UNT, everything has revolved around creating a story, and particularly stories that allow me the opportunity to live with people and immerse myself in their day-to-day lives. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to ask, I know that in our senior level classes and even junior level classes, we were given the assignment to go find a story. And
Sure.
For somebody that maybe had never really done photojournalism and storytelling on this level, and maybe had been strictly in it for sports or, something else besides storytelling, how do you come up with this story? What is the process there? And what led you to the story that we're looking at now?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, stories come from what you're passionate about, what's around you, what you find in front of you. There's really no limit to that beyond purely your interest, and the acceptance of the people you're looking at. And so early on, just like you, we were required to do a photo essay for, I think, photojournalism too. And with that, this, keep in mind 2004, 2005, when this first piece was made, it was made about Texas shrimpers, and it was in the middle of the first Iraq War, and or the second Iraq War, and diesel prices had gone out the roof at that point. So having grown up along the Southeast Texas coastline, I found myself suddenly meeting shrimpers to try to tell that story. And the guy at the helm here is a man named Buddy Trebig, who I asked if I asked an oysterman if he knew any shrimpers, and the oysterman called Buddy, and Buddy was on the loudspeaker. He said, "Yeah, come on, tell him to come right now." And so I packed up my bag and went to Buddy's house and spent the next week, working on his boat, or watching him wake up at 5:30 in the morning and pay his bills, and we'd spend the nights at home eating hamburger helper and drinking box wine mixed with Zima, and watch the Jeffersons on TV. And, and like I said, owning a business is, I guess I didn't say this, but owning a business is a round the clock thing, which I soon found out once I graduated UNT. And much like these shrimpers, I mean, their life revolves around how much they're willing to do. So there's this never ending task ahead of them as small business owners that I today, really relate to. Something breaks, you got to fix it. It's up to you. So, this I just pulled out 4 favorites from that series, but this was the dawn of my, going somewhere beyond the local assignment to go try to dive into something.
So Brandon, I've got a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind, about a couple of those images. The
Sure.
one where he and I'm assuming his wife are at the kitchen countertop and it looks like they're paying bills. And that's a really raw emotional moment, I feel like, because that's who we are as adults. And, that's not something that you want, or I know I probably wouldn't necessarily want people to see me in that state of just, some kind of turmoil or, a fragile state, if you will.
Sure.
To be able to capture an image like that, how do you become just a fly on the wall and kind of become invisible to be able to capture such raw emotions like that?
Gosh, I mean, everything is, everyone in every situation is different. I mean, in this particular case with Buddy, he was really hurting financially from the economic fallout of the war. And this piece was ultimately ended up running with the Dallas Morning News while I was freelancing there my senior year. But he allowed me into the privacy of his home, because he believed the story would churn up some interest and make a difference in state government or some, at some level. And so, I mean, I think there was, in this particular case, a give and take, a willingness to give, in order to, possibly get some help in the end,
Yeah.
and, but that said, I mean, I've had assignments where I've had to, literally, photograph, family, a mother and father who have lost their child in a tornado in Oklahoma in the child's bedroom. I mean, you do a lot of sensitive stuff in this line of work, and each one takes its own sort of sense of perception to understand the air that you're in, and how to minimize yourself to the furthest extent while at the same time building some relationship bridge, and that is fundamentally, which I think you'll see in most all of my bodies of work I'll show today, is the underlying thing, this idea of finding commonality with people and building that sense of trust and respect, and through an honest, candid, dialogue, from the outset.
Absolutely. So here's another question for you from the audience is, do you feel that the best photos are made or just captured?
Gosh, that's something I'm dealing with now. I didn't pull my most recent work to show today. But there is, what I'm finding out, my entire career has largely been upon, taking images, waiting for something to happen. And at some points in my work in Mississippi with my book, there's a lot of collaboration involved for portraiture. It always underlined, the common photojournalism themes of, don't create, just, take. But, now I'm finding that now that the book is published, I'm looking for other projects and have started one where I am creating, like, I'm trying to illustrate a concept by a Longfellow poem, and it's very freeing. It's honestly, it's very quick. It can be what you want it to be. There's room for interpretation, and there's a freedom in that of creating in a way. But to some degree, all of this work, whether it's photojournalism or not, to some degree, there's some shape or form of collaboration involved, so that you even have the opportunity to take the photograph.
Absolutely. It's all about anticipating that moment and being present and not letting your mind wander so that you can be sharp. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, there's plenty of times I've been caught up with like a beer can to the mouth at some place, having too good a time with the people I'm with, and I realize I'm laughing at something I should be taking a photograph of.
Absolutely. But I think being present in that moment with them also allows you to capture something greater down the road. I mean, right?
Exactly.
So, real quick, something about, it looks like we've got a technical question here. Is there anything that made shooting with a traditional camera actually easier than a digital camera? So I guess film here. Are there any things you could do in film that you preferred over digital photography?
My film work will be in a few projects down in the presentation, but I see film and digital and 35 millimeter cameras and square format cameras and large format cameras as simply tools in a tool bag. One thing is good for one. I mean, you don't use a hammer to screw a screw. And for me, the 35 millimeter and the digital, it's quick. I think it deals with more intuition. I notice in my own work, I'm more fast paced. There is some like sort of bridge with, once I started shooting medium format film, I was naturally starting to center weight images in the square. It's a tendency, it's hard to break. And when I would go on assignment, the next day or the next week with my 35 millimeter, I'd suddenly find myself replicating that, putting things in the center of the frame. And it's something I've like strove not to do, but I don't know, they each have their place. If I could say anything about the relationship between film and digital, it's the fact that there's a preciousness to the film. And most importantly, it's made me slow down and really think about what I'm doing. And I think the So I had a professor at UNT. She was an adjunct professor, Mona Reeder, who was a photographer on staff at the Morning News at the time.
Love her.
Mona's like a second mother. We were still, this is a time when our biggest like flash cards in our digital cameras, I think were like 500 megabytes or something, 256 megabytes.
Right.
And so she made us for one assignment, take a 256 megabyte file or card, and we would have to go shoot an essay and only use what, the card would allow. And she would check your meter to make sure you didn't delete and put up some more images in the card. But, if anything, the film, like in that sense, made me slow down and give myself some time to breathe. And in that sense, it revolutionized my process in shooting, of shooting with intent and not wasting anything. Because when I'm on the road, I only have so many boxes of film, and B&H is pretty expensive to overnight a bunch of medium format to you. So,
and they close a lot. They don't.
And they've got a lot of holidays. Yeah, they do.
If in case you're not, completely submerged in the photography world, B&H is like the Amazon, if you will, for photographers. You can get all the good things there, but they do celebrate all the holidays, and that can sometimes be challenging. You have to plan ahead. Yeah. And speaking of that, I've got my 512 right here. Yeah. Gosh. Look at that. So
what was that, in a time capsule? Where'd you get that thing from?
The junk drawer. Duh.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that brought back a lot of memories. I've got a whole stack of over here. It's kind of embarrassing, but I remember that assignment, and I appreciate that assignment so much as well. It was a lot of fun, and it was very challenging, and you really had to think about things. So it was great. Yeah. So Brandon, let's see some more. Let's talk about your trip to Alaska, because I think that is really, really fascinating, and how you got there and what led you there. And I think that the way you ended up in Alaska is really fascinating.
So while I was interning at the Dallas Morning News, the fall semester of 2005, another UNT alum who had started freelancing there, Rick Gershon, we were at the Collin County office for the Morning News one night, and I was turning in probably my fourth assignment for the day or something. And he said, what are you working on? What are you doing? I'll never forget this. And so I don't know. I mean, I'm driving around the Metroplex for the Morning News, trying to make some money and pay my student loans and or pay my bills. And he said, I mean, that's not important. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I mean, personal projects are where you can not only like grind your teeth and develop a point of view, but it's a way of showing people what your interests are, and that made, I mean, that was like this chasm that opened up. Like suddenly I was like, oh wow, like there's a whole nother part of the world that I haven't leapt over yet. And so that week I was at the political science building. I spent at UNT, actually, I think I'm like 2 classes away from actually having a double major in international development. And I spent, I think, most of my time in political science. But I got out of class one night and I thought, what can I do? And I found this website called stopglobalwarming.org. And back then, they had this website with all these interactive emblems across the map of the US, and it could have been grass fires in the Southwest or hurricanes in the Southeast. But up on the top left corner in the furthest part of Alaska, there was this traditional Inuit headdress. And I said, well, let's see what that is. So it told me the story about this tiny native village called Shishmaref that sits about 120 miles northwest of Nome in the Chukchi Sea. And I Googled it, I got a telephone number for the island. I called them up and I said, yes, is this really happening? And the woman said, yeah, our island is falling apart. We have people that walk the seashore, watching for houses to fall in and what have you. I thought, well, gosh, man, this is so interesting. Maybe I ought to look into this. So I did. I did the absolute worst possible thing you could ever do. And I got a United Airlines business credit card. And I racked it up with like the 4 flights it takes to get to Alaska, the cold weather gear, the food, the backpack, the extra camera cards, all of that stuff, and took off. And that was August of 2006. And I spent a month up there living with the villagers. And that, if Buddy and the shrimping, story, laid a foundation for, putting myself in someone else's home. This was like getting kicked off the boat. I mean, you take 4 flights to get there. It takes literally all day. And by the time you get there, you depart from the little twin prop Cessna when there's nothing in between you and civilization for hours of airline time. And then you land on this little island. You get off, and I remember a woman had pulled up on a 4-wheeler with a little trailer hooked to it, and we're loading up some supplies off the airplane. They get 2 airplanes a day, one in the morning, one in the evening, for supplies and passengers. But she said, "Are you going to the hotel?" I thought, yeah, I'm going to the hotel. And so she pulls me up to this 2-bedroom double-wide trailer that had no running water, but it had HBO1 and HBO2. And it was, so the owner of the trailer that I was renting from, his daughter and her boyfriend were living next door to the trailer I was staying in. And so I'm naturally, they were about my age, and I started making friends with them, and then they would introduce me to people. And the island's only like a half-mile wide and 3 miles long. And it was slowly being consolidated thanks to the shore erosion. So much like this man here, walking along the beach, you'll see in the next image, they're just surrounded by water. This is the bay on the east, and that's the mainland that you see in the background. The water is really shallow in the bay for the first maybe 200 yards or so. And then on the western side is the sea, which gets craggy in wintertime. There's big shards of ice that come up from the smashing, and you can see a house in the distance, and that's what they were fighting against. So I spent upwards of 2 months with them in total, one month in the summer, and then returned literally the day after I graduated UNT. I got on an airplane and went right back, except that time I looked like the Michelin Man because it was wintertime. And and we captured just sort of daily life in the streets until, someone, asked if they could borrow my cigarette lighter, or, strike up conversation, asking what I was doing there, and they'd invite me into their home. And the Weawana family is the family that ultimately really took me in. They had their whole family lived on the island. And so I would regularly go over. They lived like 5 doors down, and eat dinner with them. And we'd go fishing and berry picking. We'd go, inland and pitch tent and camp for a couple days and just pick berries in the tundra. And I'm literally they're laying like right beside where I'd sleep at night. And there's like 5 of us all crammed in the tent, including the baby. And, there's a real sense of trust that has to be developed in there, right? Like I'm sleeping with them, these strangers, and their grandson and their 2 daughters. And I think, it was just a testament to the openness of the families, and like a genuine, openness, They weren't, this particular island for a year or 2 leading up, it was getting a lot of media attention. It was like one of the biggest showcases for climate change for a period of time. But so they were versed in media people coming. But I think we, with so much time, we've kept in touch on Facebook. I mean, this is like 18 years later, whatever.
So what condition is the island in right now?
Largely the same. The state, federal governments had built a giant rock retainer wall back then that serves its purpose of keeping the sea storms at bay. Essentially, what's happening in that region is that the protective sea ice that forms in the fall, early winter, isn't forming fast enough. So as the winter storms come in, from the Arctic. These huge squalls will end up busting up the sea line. And ultimately, I think some reports back then said 150 yards of beach would be just vanished in one storm. So, their big grand scheme plan, this is back when Sarah Palin was still governor, was to accrue funding to move inland. And then the big debate was always, do you move these people that have lived in a traditional hunter and subsistence gathering lifestyle into a city, which this one would be Nome, where there's all sorts of things that can happen. Alcohol is really prevalent there. They lose their traditional ways. There's not a ton of jobs. And or do you find the funds to relocate to a place that provides the exact same type of living situation, the same type of herds to hunt, caribou, or the same types of fishing parameters and things like that. I don't, they're still there. They're still on the island. I mean, it's a monumental task and a ungodly amount of money to move one village, evidently. But I remember back then, Shishmaref was, I think Alaska has somewhere of like 109 villages, native villages. And of those back then in 06, I think 10 or so were facing imminent danger and needing immediate evacuation, or to some degree of evacuation need. So this is a big pervasive problem that nobody has solved and still doesn't today. So
these are absolutely beautiful. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, that's all right. I'm just rambling at this point.
No, I could listen to you ramble all day. Here's another good question for you. So what are some of the biggest obstacles that you have faced to getting the shots that you want, and how did you overcome those?
I think what we talked about earlier, just being conscious, and to some degree, a big hazard for me particularly is falling in too much, and just being a part of the place and not remembering that doesn't just take photographs.
Yeah.
That's pretty easy to do.
And I think that can apply to anybody who's taking a photograph. I mean, whether you're at an event, a wedding even, or submerged in a photo story like this, or if you're just a mom at home trying to capture some sweet moments with your kids or family, it's very easy to get caught up in being present in the moment and not remembering, but I don't know about you, Brandon. I see moments all the time and compositions, and I think, gosh, if I had my camera right now, I would be all over that, and you tend to start seeing with a photographic eye. You see life in a photographic way, and so I think it makes it a lot more fun too. But so I know that you have a book out there for people to check out and purchase, and that's available on your website. Is that right?
Yeah.
Brandon, you want to shameless plug, throw your website out there for us.
Okay, I'll have to find it right quick.
btimages.com? Is that right?
btimagery.com, and then I'll just put it in the chat box.
Oh, look at you, just doing all the jobs. I like it.
Yeah, I'm a multitasker. My wife has trained me. There you go.
Oh man, I need her tips and tricks there.
Yeah.
So, hey, we've got another question, because I know that you also do freelance as well. And so like you said at the beginning, you could be at a homicide 1 minute, kindergarten classroom the next. But if you are put on an assignment that, maybe not as glamorous as you had hoped, and maybe it's just a headshot, you need to go in and get a corporate headshot or an environmental portrait or something along those lines. How do you get, especially if you have to work with a group of people, how do you get them together and make them smile and make it look good without, really forcing it?
Yeah. This is why I don't do weddings specifically. I abstain from weddings. We'll never do them. I think with all work, building rapport is the underlying foundation, right? And how do you build rapport? You've got to speak, you got to communicate. A lot of portrait people, portraits are an intense thing. I always sort of strayed when it came to a portrait assignment. I think I was early on just really insecure. I preferred the idea of being a fly on the wall and shooting what I'm seeing and not having to interact with people very much. But then portraits opened up this whole other world to you of relationship building, of communication, of, and knowing what you want, and not living it all up to whatever chance thing happens with their body language, which that in of itself has its own value. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, for me particularly, it's about me feeling as comfortable as the person on the other side of the camera. If I literally had this yesterday on an assignment for Bloomberg, where I was photographing the head of a public health department here in Houston, and he was really image conscious. Like he was checking his shirt, he wanted to see the back of the camera when we finished, like to see if he had any creases in his shirt or how he looked. And it's rare that people actually ask to look at the back of your camera on a shoot, but when they do, it's like, saying, take your clothes off. And and with that whole experience, I realized that, and there wasn't much I could do about controlling myself. I started shelling up, right? Like I was really impatient with myself. I would come up with some, let's do this then, or let's do that, or let's try this light out, or let's get over here. And all the while you're just creating confusion and chaos because you don't know what you want, Right. And so sometimes that's what it takes, right?
Sure.
That's a way to answer the question, but that's a real world thing that just happened yesterday.
I totally get it. And, I will say, as someone who has shot a lot of weddings, that whole, guys, just fake laugh, throw your heads back and laugh, just force it out. And the more you can fake it till you make it, right? I mean, sure. We're all trying to do it at some point. Here's another really great question. And I know we're getting really, really close to being out of time, but I really like this question. Yeah, I know, right? It flew by. So your portraits from the Santa Fe school shooting that were in the Texas Monthly online yesterday, this person says they were really strong. And was that a hard shoot for you?
No, it wasn't. Because they were so kind and wanted their story told, and they had done so much work personally to rebuild themselves, and that's a constant struggle. They just made it easy, right? Like what complicated things is I've just bought a portable light because magazines tend to prefer artificial lighting a lot, and it's something I've always strayed from because I've always felt like it's just one more gearbox to break, and when you're trying to do something, it's right. Like, what's the point? But I am realizing now that I've bought this monolight that travels and has a battery in it and all this stuff, that it does free me up as long as you know how to use it right, and your camera. It does allow things to happen that wouldn't normally happen with natural light. But my entire life, and I've tried to abstain from that and just use natural available light as a puzzle to be solved. And with that portrait the other day ran on Monday. Those portraits, we couldn't go in their home, which is a growing theme with during COVID right now. Most people don't want you in their home, or most publications don't want you to go into people's homes and put yourself at risk. So the hardest part was trying to figure out where to shoot them that was still relevant to the story visually. I've had a lot of assignments here recently that are portraits, and it's of somebody that feels this way about COVID or somebody that feels that way about COVID. And, ultimately you're shooting them outside their house, right? And so you got trees to work with, you hopefully don't have a brick wall. There's only so much nature that is, like you can use for the portrait that keeps the photograph relevant for the topic. And a lot of times we would try to stray from, dappled lighting coming through trees. But in this case, we wanted mood. I know the art director, really wanted some moodiness to the work. And so we tried to, just find the patchy spots of light in the trees and get away from this sort of, my mono light that lights up everything. And and just kind of problem solve with what we had around us. And fortunately, I think I spent like 3 hours visiting with them. I mean, it was literally, I looked up and the sun was setting and I still had to go shoot the high school, and totally forgot about the high school until I got in the car and was headed home. But again, I think that's a prime example of we just had so much to speak about and to relate to. And I think that's the power of portraiture, is that, you know, you are finding those commonalities, you are trying to make people comfortable, and through that dialogue, you know, only through that dialogue is that gained. And we just have, I think we've all had a lot of trauma between us and could speak about perseverance and overcoming hurdles. So
I think that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing.
that was a lot of words to answer that question. Sorry.
No, we're storytellers, right? You've got to tell the story. And
we're ramblers.
No, I love that. I think that's really fascinating. There are so many questions I'm looking at on my agenda over here that we haven't even touched on. And,
Sure.
you know, so I'm sitting here thinking, you know, if we've got an amateur photographer out there that is looking for some piece of advice to take away with them today, what is one or two things that you could offer up to them?
To never mind the camera that you're using. It doesn't mean beans, you know. Like I said earlier, cameras are just, you know, tools that, you know, it's just like having 3 or 4 different size paintbrushes. The other thing is that, you know, so number one, don't get caught up in the technical stuff. It doesn't really matter. And two, the most powerful, you know, the most powerful stories are the ones that, you know, inspire passion in people. And that passion is only created through something that you feel passionate about. So, I mean, if you want to tell, you know, moving stories that convey a successful sense of an idea, I think you've got to be convinced of it yourself. You know, you've got to be immersed in it yourself, whether that is literally living in it or, you know, researching it to the 10th degree and just knowing it, you know.
Yeah. So speaking of being inspired and researching and getting to know your story and your background and really getting into it, what took you to Mississippi very quickly? And can you show us a couple of images from that journey?
Yeah. Let me share the screen again.
Totally caught you off guard. And I know we should be wrapping up, but I'm being selfish.
Stay on longer if you want. I'm okay. We can't go out of town until my wife gets off of work, so I'm all yours. If people want to stay longer, that's fine.
Awesome.
Oh shit, wrong one. Hold on.
So speaking of cameras and the tools in the toolbox, unless you just have thousands of dollars lying around, they could also be considered toys and your babies, if depending on, you know, what kind of toys you're messing with. So you spoke earlier about the DSLR versus mirrorless. I wouldn't mind, you know, having one of those tools either. So I feel you.
Yeah, no, I've got a 4x5 that I just bought some film for, and I've yet to break it out. I've had it for 5 years and haven't taken a single picture with it.
Wow.
Yeah. All right. So I know we're running on time. I'll get to this. So this body of work is called In That Land of Perfect Day. It began in the summer of 2009. I was riding my bicycle across the northern western part of Mississippi. And I had a sort of novice understanding of the Mississippi Delta, much like most people would know, you know, of the history of racial strife. You immediately come to mind of large, expansive fields of agriculture, of cotton, you know, and the blues music. And I'd been traveling across the country and landed in the Delta, not really having much of an agenda. And until I just started making some inroads with folks and falling into the communities and hearing things. So this body of work that is more or less ongoing now, though published in 2017. Basically, for those years, I've been living with and photographing African-American families in the Delta and quirky name places like Alligator, or Bobo, or Duncan. And those names in and of themselves were the things that attracted me to the towns first, because who doesn't want to know what goes on in Alligator? But during the first couple years, at some point in the first couple years of being in the Delta, I used to stay up late and listen to sermons on YouTube, and I had come across a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Sermon he gave in 1967, in November 67, so the fall before he was assassinated. And he was speaking about civil disobedience, and he used the biblical story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to explain this concept that one of the first documented instances of civil disobedience was the three men refusing to bow down to King Nebuchadnezzar's golden idol. And in doing so, they were tossed into a fiery furnace. And the story says that when the king's guard peered into the chamber, he saw not three men standing in the flames, but four, and the fourth presumably being their Lord and Savior, shepherding them from the heat. So with that in mind, Dr. King said that somewhere along the way, you should discover something that is so dear, so precious to you, something that is so eternally worthful that you could never give it up. You ought to discover some principle. You ought to have some great faith that grips you so much that you could never give it up. And somehow you must go on and say, I know that the Lord that I worship is able to deliver me, but if not, which is the title of the sermon, I'm going on anyhow. I'm going to stand up for it anyway. And so, what he's talking about here are two themes, faith and perseverance, essentially. And he says, I think this is really applicable today as it was in 67, as it was, at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, this idea of standing up for what you believe is right, because it's what he says is it's right to do right. He says it's lovely to love. And so with that in mind, that this whole concept began to create the foundation of the images that I was making in the Delta from then on, and I began to sort of reflect on what avenues I was seeing these themes. And one would be in the lives of ordinary men and women, just striving to pave their way through the day, right? And working in fields that they don't own, wives taking care of children. I would hear it in, echoed in the choruses of songs we would sing in little churches, like by and by, this little light of mine, or take my hand, precious Lord. And in fact, the title of the book, In That Land of Perfect Day, derives from by and by. The original title of this project was called When Morning Comes. So by and by, when the morning comes, when the saints of God are gathering home, we will tell the story of how we've overcome. We will understand it better by and by, right? And finally, the third element was I was asked at one point in the project if I had been to a place they called Chocolate City, and I thought, no, I haven't. And so they said, you need to go to Mount Bayou. And Mount Bayou is one of the oldest completely African American communities in the U.S. It was founded by the man right on top, Isaiah T. Montgomery. He was born a child slave to the Joseph Davis plantation, Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy's older brother. Mr. Montgomery's father was the postmaster on the plantation, and he owned the commissary, and so he was the top man for the enslaved people. And when the Confederacy fell, Benjamin Montgomery, Isaiah's father, and Isaiah were able to purchase the Davis plantation, so the very heart of the Confederacy, from the Davises for a sum total of $300,000. They took this loan. And there's some argument as to how the Davises allowed that to happen. But ultimately, you found that in the very heart of the Confederacy, you had now in the hands of freedmen and women, the state of Mississippi's third largest cotton plantation. For a number of instances, that plantation fell. There was a pestilence, there was a flood, cotton prices had fallen post-war, there was no need for uniforms. And ultimately, they defaulted on the loan, and the lands went back to the Davises. But shortly thereafter, about 15 years later, after Isaiah's father had passed away, Isaiah and his cousin Benjamin Green, who would be to the left of the man with the bow tie, cropped out two hand-painted portraits. This is in their city hall. they put an ad in the Natchez and Vicksburg papers looking for their like-minded brethren that had scattered after the plantation, had changed hands again. And they said, we're going to settle this new territory in the Delta where a railroad is coming through. And so you had this band of men and women gathering up to go chop down the virgin forest of the Delta, which today, if you were to drive through, is cleared land for as far as you can see. But researching this town, Mount Bayou, where I'd stay with a Baptist preacher there. I'd come to town and stay for a week or so, and I'd stay with Reverend Hall. I'd found this 1910 article in the New York Times where there was a subtext in the story about the founding of the town, where it said that Isaiah Montgomery up top began to see his men falter at the task at the task, and he said, "Why stagger at the difficulties set before you? Have you not for centuries braved the miasma and hewn down forests at the command of your masters? Can you not this day perform the same heroic duty for yourselves and your children unto successive generations, that they might learn to live and worship beneath their own vine and fig tree?" So those words took the dreams of enslaved generations and turned them into reality, filled with black bankers, doctors, and lawyers in the heart of the Delta, which was one of the harshest places for an African-American family to reside. So the point of all of this is that in this body of work, I've been dealing with sort of ideas of Black identity, real Black identity, but also these commonalities that we all have, right? Of needing something and desiring something, or dreaming for something and striving with all our might to make it happen, right? And I think that's the one underlying thing that I could say about the work, is this idea of the right to pursue, right? And celebrating the people that are there. I mean, I think it's really easy to get lost in the history of the place and romanticize it, but that oftentimes excludes the families and lives that are there today. So I would live with one family named predominantly, and their name is the Coffee family. And from their relationships in the Delta, I would meet their aunts and uncles, their cousins, their brothers, their pastors, and those people would sort of spin me off into other communities. So ultimately, over 10 years time, 11 years time, there's about a half dozen little towns that I stay in when I go. And most of them, in between the towns, they look like this. This is winter time. This is Damien. He's part of the Coffee family. He was doing his daughter's hair that day. It was Christmas Eve. We were hungover as all get out, and his hair kept getting in his face while he was doing his daughter's hair. So he put it up like that, and then he reminded me that he had this tattoo on his back he wanted a picture of. So most of this work was, a lot of times it was spent doing a lot of nothing, and then a little bit of doing something. Most of it's just hanging out with families, waking up late, taking kids to school when people slept in, or going to church. Church and family and faith are big components of the work, and rightly so. They're big components of the families there. And I like to play with images, with squares, especially with these with this religious iconography. I think sometimes two images, when combined in a diptych like this, can bring forth this sort of third element. So the idea of a decapitated snake paired with a Christmas angel might insinuate some idea of like overcoming temptation or defeat of the devil or something like that, right? And a lot of times I just look for these tiny things, these soft-spoken things that oftentimes scream, though, like this tribute to President Obama. And keep in mind that this body of work began about 4 months after President Obama took office, and it ended in the book published shortly after he left office. So I'm always looking for little things like this.
The details matter. The details
Yeah,
matter.
they do.
I think, oh, this is beautiful. I mean, this is so fascinating, Brandon. And so I really want to encourage everyone that's viewing on Facebook or even here in Zoom, you are looking at the works of Brandon Thibodeaux and our UNT alumnus, photojournalist, freelance photographer located down in the Houston area. Is that right, Brandon?
Yep.
All right. But available for work for hire all over the place. So he does travel when he can. So Brandon, thank you so much for your time. I mean, this has just been such a treat and a joy, and I just can't thank you enough for that. So guys, thank you for joining us and viewing and sitting with us and learning